The panel was advertised as honest. Real people, real stories, no cliches. The room filled quickly, couples sitting too close, singles sitting carefully apart, everyone pretending they were there for insight and not reassurance. The moderator smiled, adjusted the microphone, and invited the speakers to introduce themselves. They talked about communication first, about listening, about compromise. Heads nodded, pins moved. It all sounded right. Safe. Practiced. Then the questions from the audience began. A woman in the second row asked how to know when love turns into habit. A man near the back wanted to know if it was normal to miss being alone while still loving someone deeply. Another asked how long you're supposed to fight before you're allowed to stop. The panel answered politely, thoughtfully, carefully, but something was missing. It was clear in the pauses between answers, in the way some speakers avoided eye contact when certain questions came up, in how the audience leaned forward, waiting for something real, something slightly uncomfortable. Finally, one of the panelists spoke without being prompted. She admitted that her longest relationship hadn't ended because of cheating or betrayal, but because neither of them knew how to say, "I'm not happy anymore," without feeling like a failure. The room went quiet. Phones lowered. Someone in the back exhaled audibly. Another panelist followed, confessing that he'd stayed in a relationship 2 years too long because it looked good from the outside, and he didn't want to disappoint people who weren't living his life. He said love isn't always loud when it ends. Sometimes it just gets very quiet. The conversation shifted after that. Less advice, more truth. People stopped asking what they should do and started asking how to be honest without being cruel, how to choose growth without burning everything behind you, how to accept that some relationships don't fail, they finish. When the panel ended, no one rushed for the exit. Small groups formed. Strangers talked to strangers like they'd known each other longer than an hour. Some couples held hands tighter. Some sat apart, thoughtful, not angry, just awake. As people filed out, the moderator thanked everyone for coming. But what lingered wasn't the structure of the discussion or the credentials of the panelists. It was the realization settling quietly in the room. Most people don't need more rules about relationships. They need permission to tell the truth about the ones they're in. And sometimes, the most important part of a relationship panel isn't what gets said on stage. It's what finally gets admitted to yourself on the way home. The conversations didn't end when the chairs were stacked and the microphones were turned off. They followed people into the hallway, into the cold night air outside the building, into cars where the radio stayed off longer than usual. For many, the panel had opened a door they hadn't planned to walk through, not toward answers, but toward questions they could no longer ignore. One couple walked out together, but in silence. Not an angry silence, not the kind filled with blame, more like a careful one. The kind that comes when both people realize they've been avoiding the same truth from opposite sides. Later that night, sitting at their kitchen table, they talked more honestly than they had in years. Not about fixing things, but about how tired they both were of pretending everything was fine. It wasn't a breakup conversation. It was something quieter, more dangerous. A conversation about reality. A woman who had come alone stood outside scrolling through her phone, rereading messages she'd ignored for months. She finally replied to one she'd been afraid to answer, not because she knew what she wanted, but because she knew silence was no longer an option. The panel hadn't told her what to choose. It had reminded her that choosing nothing was still a choice. One of the panelists sat in his car for a long time before driving home. He replayed his own words in his head, realizing how much of his advice had been shaped by decisions he hadn't fully faced himself. He thought about the relationship he spoke about in past tense, even though it technically still existed. He understood now that honesty on stage had created a responsibility off it. In the days that followed, emails arrived. Messages from attendees thanking the speakers, not for solutions, but for permission. Permission to leave. Permission to stay differently. Permission to admit that love can exist without certainty, and commitment doesn't always mean permanence. The panel was never repeated in the same way. Future discussions tried to recreate the honesty, but something about that night remained unique. Maybe because truth can't be scheduled. Maybe because people only open up when they're ready to hear themselves. What no one said out loud that night, but many understood afterward, was simple and unsettling. Relationships don't ask us to be perfect. They ask us to be present. And presence, once practiced, makes it impossible to hide from the life you're actually living. Some people left that panel and changed nothing. Others changed everything. But no one left unchanged. Because once you hear the right truth at the right time, even quietly, you carry it with you. And it keeps asking to be answered.